In January of 2015, I went up to my seminary in Philadelphia for an intensive week-long course. And on the second day of that class, I came back from our lunch break, late and in tears. I tried to sneak in and sit in the class and hide my face from my colleagues and my professor so they wouldn't ask me that dreadful question, what's wrong? But I couldn't stop crying, and so eventually my professor turned and said, what's wrong? I couldn't lie. I couldn't make up an answer, and so I told them. I told them that I was in the midst of a miscarriage for the second time in 6 months, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know how to mourn the loss of a child that had never been. And in that moment, my colleagues and my professor came to me. They stood around me, they placed their hands on my shoulders and on my head, and they prayed for me. They prayed for my healing. Healing of body and mind and spirit. They prayed for strength. They prayed that I would not lose hope, that I would not lose my faith. And when they left, when they removed their hands from me, they took with them some of the burden of my grief. It was still there. I was still sitting in the pit of despair, and yet some of the burden was gone. Some of the pain had lessened. I knew that I had people who cared about me. I knew I had people who would hold me in their faith when I had no faith of my own. We are no good at grief. We as a society, we as individuals are no good at grief. Like everything in our lives, we want it to be ordered. We want to know when grief will end and when it will be out of our lives. We want it to have a timeline that makes sense. We want to be able to say to ourselves and to others, this is it, the grief, it's gone. And yet there are pains in our lives that never leave us. There are things that will stay with us forever. When we are grieving, we don't know how to deal with it. We don't know how to invite others into that place. We hide our tears and our faces so that they won't ask, what's wrong? And when we see others grieving, we are so frequently overcome with the urge to do something that we do so many things that are wrong. And we say so many things that are completely unhelpful. We say things like, God would never give you more than you can handle. Or we say things like, just get over it. It's been a year. Or perhaps worst of all, we try to make them see the silver lining. At least you know you can have children. At least you have a spouse. At least you didn't lose everything. At least you're still alive. But in the pit of grief, none of that helps. And in fact, it piles on more pain and more weight. We're bad at grief. But the Bible is good at grief. We read our text from Lamentations today, but also that psalm. Perhaps the end was a little disturbing, but the psalm and this text from Lamentations show us how to vent our grief. Look back at the words in Lamentations. The writer writes this in the midst of Jerusalem's exile, as Israel is in the land of Babylon. They've lost their homes. They've lost the place that they know. The writer describes Israel as desolate, lonely, worried about its children, alone with no friends, in the midst of enemies. And that's it. There's no point in Lamentations where the writer tries to say, at least. There's no point in Lamentations where the writer tries to lift up hope and build a false hope. Rather, the writer simply names the grief and leaves it there. We have many psalms of lament, and this one that we read today is similar. And in the same way, these psalms of lament simply vent the grief. Some of them end with hope that God will rescue the writer. But many of them are filled with anger and fear, railing against God for letting these things happen. The Bible gives us an example of what grief should look like. How we are called to share our grief. To say, this is what is happening and it sucks. And to leave it there. The Bible encourages us in many places to share our grief with our community. You know, when you share joy, joy multiplies. The more people who are involved in the joy, the happier, the more exciting, the greater it seems. But it's not the same with grief. When we share our pain, our sadness, and our grief, it doesn't multiply as more people hear of it. But rather, like my colleagues and my professor walking away, those who hear can lift some of the burden. They may not change the reality of what's happening, but they change how it affects us. Simply by naming what's going on, we give grief less power over us. And we give the opportunity for those around us to help us through that. So maybe we need to get better at naming our griefs. We have grief right now as a nation. We have grief in an uncertain present. Fear for the future. And mourning over the loss of a past, whether it's real or imagined. We have grief here in this community of New Hope. Grief over what we once were when we were a part of Trinity. Grief over losing the status that we had in this community. The place that we had, the knowledge that people in the community had of us. Grief over the relationships lost and changed by leaving that place. And grief over not yet being what we want to be. And we have our individual griefs. We have pain and disease. We have the grief of losing loved ones. We have the grief that comes with life changes like moving or losing jobs or changing jobs or children growing up and moving away. And maybe we need to take a cue from the writer of Lamentations and just name these griefs. We were not meant to live alone. We were not meant to live with the pain of this world sitting on our shoulders alone. In the creation story, when God creates Adam, he then says it's not right for the man to be alone. And creates Eve. It is not right for us to be alone. If we save our joy for ourselves, it's diminished. And if we keep our grief to ourselves, if we sit in the pit of despair and don't let anyone know that we are there, we dig ourselves deeper and deeper into that hole. We are meant to live in a community. We are meant to share good and bad. Because when we have lost all faith, when we cannot trust the promise that there is new life and resurrection, those around us are there to trust, to have faith for us. When we feel abandoned by God, those around us are called to have faith, to remind us that God really is there, and to remind us of the day when suffering and pain and grief will be no more, when all will be joy, and when every tear we have ever cried will be wiped from our faces. Resurrection and new life are real, and they are coming. But I need you to remind me of that at times. I need you to have that faith for me when I can't have it for myself. And in the same way, you need me to have that faith, that trust, that hope in God's promises. We're not meant to be alone. God created us for community. Community is good. So let us be that for each other. Amen.
Amen.